begin by saying is one of the most important things you want to keep in mind when you're using data is why it was collected and who collected it. There are very different organizations at the national, state, and local level that have reasons to collect information. The census is essentially our Bible. It is what we have to use when we are anywhere and everywhere. It's the one uniform source of information. Does anybody know why we have the census?
To determine how many legislators we have?
That's correct. So it is a part of the Constitution, Article 13. And so it's a very important element of our national identity, actually. And many countries around the world have basically mimicked our census. So actually, after the Second World War, we went around and promoted our own data collection. And we were definitely the farthest ahead. We were the first to automate and first to move to a sample and a whole set of other characteristics. So you want to know why it's collected and for whom.
And I would also ask, and how, because the methods behind a lot of the economic statistics vary quite a bit.
Quite a lot.
Understanding, like, what is county business service, county business patterns, methods versus the economic census methods versus the QECW, what we old people call the ES202 series. There are different methods, different bases, so having an understanding of that is important.
Right. And it's also important to understand who collects it because it influences how they treat things. So for example, the Department of Commerce collects data on the economy, not for our use. They collect it on behalf of industry. And so the way that it views its role in making information available, how much is disclosed, how much they guarantee privacy, those are all things that go to the heart of why that data is collected. It's collected to provide a perspective on the national economy, and it's also, therefore, asking business organizations to reveal information that we then guarantee cannot disclose who they are at a geographic level. There also is information, so let's talk about the census for a minute. What is the census actually? What's the unit of analysis in the census?
The individual? The individual?
The individual and what?
Household?
No, it's a census of people and housing. So the census is not people, and then just it's extraneously collecting information on housing. Those two things are twinned together. And why are they twinned together? What do you think? So you can map it? Yeah, that you certainly can. We have to have a way to identify where people are. So in the old days, when people actually lived in a place and didn't move around very much, and their identity was attached to a particular facility, then it was very easy to say, okay, well, how do we find people? We go to the house. As time has gone on and the population has changed and we've got new elements of the population, for example, we have migratory workers, we have undocumented people, all of those things add to the complexity. And many of the suits that come before the courts about the census and its efficacy actually are tied to its inability to attach people to a particular place. And Eric Schulteis, who's a PhD student, has done work in California looking at the question of migratory workers, what you might consider illegal structures, people inhabiting them, how do we count them, the homeless, and things like that.
And that's a very important point to understand, that the census data is information on people based on where they live, not based on where they work.
Right.
So that sort of distinction between the labor force and employment, the labor force is about where people live.
And further to that, since the census is about people in a particular place where they live, the census is not the optimal source of information for economic analysis, because it's not studying the unit you're interested in. If you're interested in employment, you want to get as close to the employer as possible.
Yeah, it's useful for occupational data for understanding the labor force.
Right.
But not for understanding the, business activity, jobs, and employment.
With that said, the census is a self-designating data source. So people describe themselves in their workplace, and the error, the NSF has estimated the error, that is what do people say they are versus actually what they are, is at least 30%. So when you're using the census for occupations, you have to realize that there's a self-reporting quality to it, which may diminish its precision. And certainly as you go down in geography, that's always an issue. Okay, and then finally, institutions. There's a lot of information on institutions and organizations. And when we think about such things as businesses, we have business organizations, they have structures, they have functions, and in the federal data system, there's a specific type of designation for firms and the attributes of a firm in terms of whether it's an establishment. An establishment just means a physical facility. There are auxiliary units, there are designations for sole proprietorships. There's a whole set of definitions which are really important for you to pay attention to whenever you open up a census or open up an economic database. Read it carefully and think immediately, what are they defining here as the unit of analysis? Because you don't want to use the word firm or establishment or organization or institution unless you know exactly what you're talking about, because you will just introduce verbal error into your presentations. Okay, the purposes of this information. Well, for me, the information, there's a million purposes, right? But I broke it out into analysis, planning, and public presentations. And in analysis, when we're just doing work with our colleagues or we're doing a first draft in our workplace, you can buzz through the analysis and you can assume that the person you may be giving the work to is familiar with what you're trying to do. So you might think of it more as the possible back of the envelope calculations and pushing yourself toward understanding. The way we document analysis might be very kind of loose and conversational, right? Where we make assumptions about what the person who's reading it actually knows. With that said, that's the only place that I would suggest you ever have loose language or fail to provide adequate documentation for the use of information. Every other circumstance, classes, colleagues, projects, you need to have a standard practice of working with numerical information in which you need to explain the data, source, scale, time, collection, original purpose. You need to describe any method you're using, whether it's some kind of a calculation you made, even percentage change, or you're using a tool like we have in the toolbox, and you need to describe limits. And these are just the minimum requirements for professional writing with numerical information. You want to say anything, Carl?
No, I mean, it's just, it's always a challenge in where you put the detail and how much detail you put in explaining your methodology, especially in a public presentation context and stuff like that. But I do think it's important, because I think it's important to be transparent about what you've done and understand and communicate the limitations of what you've done. So even though there's a lot of pressure on you not to talk about the methodology, and I was just at a meeting where we had to cut the methodology slides because the client wanted something to be similar, but I think ultimately, certainly in any written document that really codifies what you've done, even if you have to put it in an appendix, it's very important.
And my own feeling is that in a planning process where you are working on something that is going to be a final document, but it is not in a final document stage, that you should start by writing, including the language describing all of what I said as you're going, because you're going to want to learn how to say it effectively. The reason why people want you to pitch it out is because they think it's boring and it's hard to understand. And it's your job as a professional to learn how to actually say something exciting about location quotients. You don't think you can do that, but you will if you try. And also, you are going to be working with people who are in a planning office, and they're not going to be specialists like you are in this particular area. So if you don't put it in the text from the draft stage forward, you're not helping them become smarter, but you're also not allowing them to link more effectively their work with yours. They're just making an assumption you know what you're doing. And let me tell you, everyone makes mistakes. So just truth in advertising, stick it in, and then after you've had a couple of drafts, you can move it into footnotes. But it's important to keep you aware of what it is you said, what you're trying to say, and also always checking for errors. And then finally, in public presentations, while I was sort of joking a little bit about saying you can make something interesting about location quotients, it is an art to speak with numbers. It is far easier to speak with words. But people who are really dedicated learn to speak with numbers and learn to describe how to use numbers in compelling ways. And typically they use stories. So you should think about how you can help the people you're working with understand what you're doing, because it's one thing to display it. It is still a black box until they understand it.
And I think that's very important. I think how do you use what you learned in your analysis to create a narrative about the place? And just to give you an example, when the economic development planning class was working in Worcester last spring, and they were drowning in data because there was so much stuff, and that was one of the challenges. To create a narrative, we created a narrative that had some meaning to the city economically. And we sort of ended up with this sort of, because Worcester as a city is a lot like Boston, it's very centered around large educational and healthcare institutions. A lot of the employment was there, a lot of the economic. But we kind of created a narrative about second-tier industries. There were these set of industries which were relatively high-paying, things like insurance and manufacturing and professional business services. But the city was actually losing share of employment in that. So we kind of created this narrative about the second-tier industries that were important to the city. They were sort of the good, middle-quality jobs. They were sort of access to jobs. They were addressing some of the needs of the immigrant community, especially around manufacturing. So we tried to sort of interpret the data in that way. It's not a very complicated concept, but it was a helpful concept so that we didn't end up like talking about a lot, have to go through like 10 different industries and just overwhelm people. So even some simple ideas and simple concepts can be helpful in creating a story of some sort around the data.
And what's interesting about the secondary industries is that 50 years ago, secondary industries were really considered, bit part players. But in this particular case, those are export bases. If you have education and healthcare, those are export based. Those people are coming in from the outside and they're dropping their money in, and that is actually circulating locally and making it possible for there to be a paper distributor and for there to be a healthcare supply establishment. So this is an expanded economic base that is kind of halfway between your residentiary sector and your actual export base. So they're fundamental because these types of industries raise or lower the cost of doing business for your primary employers. Okay, in terms of writing with numbers, I'm just going to note, I say here again, describe your data and tools. Once you develop a facility to tell one story with data, and you like it, and someone else tells you that it's good, think about how you discovered it, and always use it. Keep it in a little file that says, my best writing with numbers, and go back to it when you get stuck. Because what you're really struggling with are connector words. You're struggling with verbs. And you're having a hard time animating these things that look like sticks. And once you figure out a good paragraph, always keep it so you have a reminder you know how to do this. One other recommendation, which I didn't do last time, is there's a book called Style for Students. It's on the web. It is the best writing book possible ever made. A guy named Joe Shaw wrote it. And in it, he has lists of words. He has connector words. He has action verbs. He has all these elements of writing that make it possible for you to write effectively. And he wrote it for engineers and scientists, so it's perfect for somebody trying to work with numbers.
The other thing I would say is that you're implicitly making decisions about what to talk about. And that's almost as important as how you talk about it. So I think that's something you want to give some thought to, because you're going to have a lot of information. What is it important? What numbers is it important to pull out and talk about? Why are we choosing this to talk about versus and not choose that to talk about? It's worth giving a fair amount of thought to that, because if you're doing a presentation in a meeting, you may have a half an hour, 45 minutes, and you may have like 3 hours of content. You have to make decisions about what is important to talk about. So I think that's something to give some thought to, how do you make those decisions? Why do you make those decisions?
Because the obvious would be always pick the big ones, or always pick the worst. But actually, that doesn't tell you much of anything at all. That just tells you what? The extremes. But what most people really need to understand is, what do we have that actually works, and what do we have that's at risk? Okay, think about writing with numbers. So a lot of the time when you're first starting to learn to write with numbers, you start out with a number at the beginning of a sentence. 35% of the da-da-da-da-da. And even you start a paragraph with a sentence like that. Remember, go back to your very first principles of writing in elementary school and high school. And I say this not as to be condescending. I'm saying because I struggled myself, I know what it means. You need to go back and think about what the structure of writing is, because you're inserting a new object, something that you're not as familiar with working with as maybe words. And so remember, the topic sentence, what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to basically lay out what you're going to say in that entire paragraph. And the transition sentence at the end of that paragraph is supposed to be your hop on to the next paragraph. So that should tell you that you're not going to be sticking some sort of heavy, luggy thing like a number in that paragraph at the beginning or even the end, unless there's something super powerful about it, right? What you want to do instead is remember that the first sentence announces, ta-da, and the second sentence says, and now we're going to continue. And you want to keep that balance in mind. And also when you're using numbers in paragraphs, look at, if you write a paragraph and you have 5 numbers in it, you really want to think about whether that's too many numbers in that paragraph. And really think carefully about what you want to engage. If you write short paragraphs that have 5 sentences and there might be a total of 70 words in that paragraph, that sounds like really short sentences, doesn't it? But when you're writing with numbers, short sentences are almost forced upon you. So don't feel uncomfortable that it looks a little sparse. It's easier to read if it's sparse. Always think about writing with numbers from a problem perspective. It makes it a whole lot easier. What is this number signifying? What problem are we trying to address here? If you think about it, it'll help you set up your topic sentences, and it'll also help you build drama as you're writing and going forward. And whenever you're talking about data and whenever you're using a tool in the context of a problem, think about what the role the tool is playing in that problem conversation. That'll tell you right away whether you have the right tool, right? I've read plenty of stuff that's the wrong tool. You shouldn't be using that tool in this particular case. And so you want to really think about that because you could easily pick something else. There are probably 50 versions of location quotients. As you think about how it is constructed, it's a ratio of 2 numbers and a ratio of 2 numbers divided one into another. You can use anything. Oranges, apples, peaches, pears. It's basically just a characterization that allows you to look at an even playing field when there's a comparison between US and a place, and some excess or some deficit. There's millions of ways that you can use that same kind of configuration. And a guy named Walter Izard, who was the parent of the regional science field, actually wrote a book this fat called Regional Analysis that you can still buy on the web for like $2.50. It has every possible calculation you could ever want, and it's definitely worth it. I think I might have 5 copies of it, just to make sure I don't lose it. I'd give them away easily. Okay, so those are my views on just the beginnings of how to think about this.